welcome everyone. This is it's really exciting to be part of PeaceCon at 10. Thank you so much for joining us for this particular panel. We are going to be talking about going green while building peace, how technology can drive climate conservation and peace building goals. We will be having a conversation about that. This is PeaceCon at 10. The subject of the whole PeaceCon is COVID, climate, and conflict rising to the challenges of a disrupted world. And of course, the Alliance for Peacebuilding is hosting us for this. And so we have a great panel for you today. We want to leave a lot of times for Q&A. Please feel free to use the chat. We will try to be moderating that and monitoring that to make sure that we get everyone's thoughts in. We have 90 minutes with our panel, so hopefully we will get to everyone. The subject of today is, if you think about a Venn diagram of climate change and technology and conflict, there's lots of people that talk about two of those bubbles together, climate and technology, or conflict and climate. But we're trying to center this conversation in the middle of that Venn diagram, where we've got a great panel of peace builders, of technology nerds, peace builders who are technology nerds, and people who are doing some really amazing work at the grassroots level all around the world. And so we want to talk about what the relationship is between all of those three buckets, what some of the challenges and the opportunities are in this space. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce each panelist before they say a few words to start off, and then we're going to have a discussion. Please be sending questions throughout, and I will try to incorporate those questions into our conversation. I'm going to start with you, Sahar. So Sahar Tabaja is the global practice lead for peace, stability, and transition at Chemonics International. She's a conflict specialist with more than 15 years of experience designing and managing stabilization, governance, preventing and countering violent extremism, and peace-building programs in the Middle East and across the world. Sahar has focused her work on how youth, women, civil society, and local actors can positively change governance practices, alter conflict systems, and enable societal peace in fragile environments. So Sahar, I would welcome your thoughts on the topic that we have. Thank you for joining us all the way from Beirut.
Thank you, Erol. Good morning, afternoon, or evening to all of you, and thank you for joining us. And thank you for those who joined us early. Erol, as you said, this sort of intersection, this Venn diagram of climate change and conflict, we're seeing this, and we're increasingly aware of this as practitioners, whether those of us working on the climate side or on the conflict and peace building side. And we're realizing that we need to think in a different way about the intersection of these two major, challenges of our time. We know the statistics. We know that, of the 25 countries that are classified as most vulnerable to climate change by the UN, 14 are conflict affected or are in states of intractable conflict. And there are a number of ways that we've been sort of, getting our heads around what this intersection looks like. First, we know that climate change is exasperating existing grievances, be they economic, political, or social, that are generally driving conflicts. And the second is the fact that, unsurprisingly, these fragile and conflict-affected states are less equipped or ill-equipped to really handle the kind of challenges that climate change is throwing our way, whether to, enact mitigation or adaptation measures, often due to the same set of factors that are driving those conflicts themselves, whether it's poor governance, corruption, or contestation of power, or porous borders, lack of security, and so on. As we work with local communities in conflict-affected areas, we're starting to realize that this intersection is even more sort of intertwined than we realize. And there are myriad ways in which we're seeing climate change and conflict systems come together to create even more complex realities. And one thing I'd love to discuss with everyone today, and certainly with my other my fellow panelists, is how can we use better tools, or what better tools can we use to understand this complexity? Can these tools, to better understand this complexity, we need to collect more data, maybe bigger data, but also make better sense of that data to design, smarter, more sustainable solutions. Is this something that we can turn to technology for? Is there a role here, in that Venn diagram for the technological advancement on the data front to help us better understand how these complex systems are coming together? And my colleagues are going to go into sort of in-depth examples of some of the ways that this is already happening, some of the ways that we're using technology to address climate and conflict challenges. Before we dive into that, I'd love to share a few examples of how these challenges are coming together on the ground from the lens of local communities that we're working with. In northern Iraq, in Sinjar, where we're working to help people return, climate consequences have come in the form of drought, which has really devastated local agriculture on which the majority of people make a living. The Nineveh Agriculture Department estimates that because of the insufficient rainfall and the unseasonably high temperatures, cereal production is going to be reduced by 70% this year across the plain. And that obviously has a knock-on effect on livestock producers, as well as those who depend on the harvested grain to make a living. And this is an area that's been trying really hard to recover from the ISIS-inflicted genocide. So beyond the impact on agriculture and the livelihoods from agriculture, the drought is discouraging people who are displaced from returning to Sinjar. They're choosing to remain in their displacement locations because they're uncertain of how they can make a living if they go back home. And for now, it's easier for them to remain in camps or wherever they are and receive assistance and support. And we're seeing similar types of patterns emerge in Yemen. Yemen is already one of the most water scarce in the world, and we're seeing increasing conflict over access to areas of the country that are water rich, as the scarce resource dwindles even further. So while the conflict has waged, the government has been absent in large parts of the country, and there's been a lot of land grabbing happening over public lands because of access to because people are fighting for access to water. But another way that we're seeing this intersection play out in an interesting way is the fact that we're seeing conflict actors, armed actors, weaponizing the consequences of climate change to meet their war aims. So we're sort of at a more advanced level now of how climate change and conflict are interacting. It's not sort of just one is affecting the other. We have actors from within a conflict system deliberately using the consequences of climate change for their own goals. We're seeing this in the city of Taz, which had been experiencing a lot of water shortage before the war broke out, with only 70% of the city having regular access to water and benefiting from wells that were there. But since the war broke out, one Ansarullah, who are fighting the internationally recognized government of Yemen, are controlling the part of the city where the taps are, so to speak, and have effectively turned it off, leaving everyone without water. And the people are now having to truck water from other parts of the city to the areas that have been affected by this, with NGO support and everything. And the rhetoric here is that obviously this is a form of control and it's a form of pressure. And the rhetoric is that the land where the water station is being used by the military. And so therefore they have a right to sort of target it as a non-civilian infrastructure. And there are also different ways in which this is playing out. We can go into more details after during the question and answer session. I just sort of want to leave us with a couple of thoughts and questions on, how can we better understand the really complex interaction of these two systems? How can tech help us there? And where can tech be more of a problem than a solution in some places? So maybe I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Erol, and we can continue the conversation.
Fantastic, Sahar. Thank you so much for not only setting the stage, but giving some good examples. We have more people than when we started the session. So as a reminder, this is Going Green While Building Peace, how can technology drive climate conservation and peace building goals? We started with Sahar Tabaja from Chemonics International, and I'd love to turn to Anjali Nayar. Next, Anjali is the founder of TIMBY, which I believe stands for This Is My Backyard, a suite of encrypted tools used by communities, NGOs, and workers living and working on the front lines of big business to document and share issues related to human and environmental rights. I'll leave Anjali to explain more about TIMBY before I butcher it even more, but I will mention that she's not only the founder of this great organization, but she's an award-winning filmmaker, journalist, and former climate scientist. So, Anjali, is there anything you can't do? Over to you.
Or is there anything that I can do well? That's the question. Can I do it all well at the same time? So yes, TIMBY, as you mentioned, are a set of reporting tools and trainings. So a lot of support that's required every single time that you introduce technology into a system. And they're really used to collect, collate, and visualize and share information to channels that can change outcomes. So if you think of something like military grade software, something like Palantir, now put the power of those information systems into the hands of NGOs, into the hands of indigenous communities that are dealing with climate and environmental issues. That's really our goal. So currently we're in about 25 languages in nearly 50 countries around the world, running everything from whole supply chains or climate management for governments to the really on the ground work for forest conservation for indigenous communities as well as NGOs. Sahar just really set the stage in terms of thinking about how these issues of conflict and climate change and technology can really happen at the country level or the regional level. And I'd love to kind of bring that one step down to the local level. And often in our experience when we're working on these issues, trying to figure out what's going on and how to resolve them, we realize that there are mechanisms, and a lot of it comes from miscommunication at the local level that then plays out at a larger stage, on the country level or a regional level. I'd love us to focus on something very, very small, which is one of the communities that we work with in Kenya, an indigenous community called the Sengwer, and they live in the Embabit forest, which is in the Rift Valley area. And climate funding, and this is where it gets tricky, climate funding from development banks in the EU has been used to fund the country's forestry service, which is then, to save forests by equipping forestry officials that are violently evicting the Sengwer from their land, so burning huts and maiming civilians. And this is, happening at a very, very local level. But studies around the world have shown us that indigenous and local communities are really integral to a forest conservation plan. So the Sengwer want to be a part of the plan, but the government feels like they're part of the problem. So the Sengwer feel like the government is the antagonist and wants to evict them to use the land and Embabit forest for their own needs, whether it's to raise money for elections, whether it's to plant crops to support themselves. And the central government, unfortunately, there's mistrust on both sides, believe the Sengwer are clearing land And in the cases where the Sangwar have brought photographs, the Sangwar haven't always brought photographs that have a timestamp and a date stamp. So they're often talking at cross purposes about what happened and when. So in kind of the introduction of TIMBY with geostamped and timestamped evidence, it's really changed the conversation about whether something happened to what to do about it. And that's happened really in two ways with technology. On the first level, there's this evidence-based documentation, so linking satellite data, which we'll hear a little bit more about, with on-the-ground evidence, which has led to accountability. But the other thing that we didn't really anticipate would happen in these types of technology processes is this idea of a spotlight principle. So the perception of oversight in a similar way to when you're driving down the street and you see in flashing lights how fast you're going, this perception of oversight leads to better behavior, even though there isn't like an accountability system in process there. So within a month of implementing TIMBY in this particular community, the violent evictions basically stopped. All the bribes stopped. Everything stopped from middle management of the Forestry Service and local level politicians and other kind of law enforcement. And that really stopped for about a year and a half. And the Sangwar actually were able to change their monitoring system of these evictions to something that would allow them to document their positive impact on the forest. And then they could start lobbying for traditional kind of titles for their land, as well as to be part of the solution. So starting from a very sore spot where over a decade or more, there had been conflict between government and this community, to something where they could sit down and negotiate a better solution where everybody could be involved. So those are just my one tiny example in the large realm of what's possible in terms of technology, bringing people together and overcoming these miscommunication issues. I think it's also just really important there to talk about like what makes these projects at a local level successful, because technology in itself isn't the solution. You can't introduce a tool and just expect everybody will kind of use it and it will bring about peace. And things to think about when we have this roundtable kind of conversation is designing solutions that are kind of work around the flow of people's habits and their workflow. So instead of trying to get communities or NGOs or governments to adopt tools, think about being flexible and customization to design things around their needs. So if they're doing things in a particular way, introduce the tools and customize your tools to fit that particular flow of communication, so it's easier for people to adopt. The second thing to think about is ensuring that this data process isn't extractive. Communities with respect to forests have dealt with extraction in terms of palm oil, in terms of forestry, in terms of mining for so long. So data has to have a different role here. It can't be extractive. We can't be collecting data as TIMBY and trying to resolve people's problems. We have to give the tools to communities and help them use them and help them support them so that they are able to govern their own data and choose what routes could lead to remedy. And finally, collaboration. So thinking about big data, as Sahar mentioned, this localized data, satellite data, what are the other systems that could come into place to make all of these actors that are working in this space as powerful as militaries in terms of choosing solutions that will lead to remedy. So, and finally, kind of at the local level, the smallest changes when you're working with particular communities, those can lead to big changes overall, because there's going to be a kind of sharing between community and community to lead to a larger whole. So not thinking like, oh, a technology solution is going to fix all of Yemen's problems, but thinking about the localized solutions that can gain momentum and have people believe in a process, and that can be shared throughout an entire region overall. So thinking small, but enabling those small, tiny changes to lead to bigger changes overall. So that's it from me.
Thanks, Anjali. Lots of good stuff. I have a feeling we're going to come back. I think your fellow panelists will have some follow-up questions for you, as will I. I should have mentioned that Anjali is calling in from the West Coast. So we've got Beirut and the West Coast of the United States. And let's continue our world tour over to Peter Beaumont, who is, I believe, in London, if I remember that correctly. Peter Beaumont is the director he's a director at the UK-based Satellite Applications Catapult, looking after their activities in the international development and humanitarian sector. He's got a cool satellite behind him. So if you ever are watching this panel and want to, remember who the satellite guy is, there's a visual reminder right there. Before he took on this specific role, he was director of the Catapult's geospatial intelligence technology team, where he led a team of Earth observation and geospatial analysis experts. He's been working in this space in geospatial data and technologies for over 30 years in a range of technical, consultancy, and business development roles. And so we're really happy to have Peter here to tell us a little bit about the technology side of this. And I will, before we go to you, Peter, people are using the room chat, which is great. Please bump your questions in there. Courtney had a great question that also dealt with wind. And I know Anjali is dealing with 30-mile-an-hour winds right now outside her window. So we will get to these questions in a little bit. Please do put them into the chat and we'll continue on shortly with questions. But Peter, without further ado, over to you.
Well, thank you, Erol, for a great introduction. So as Erol mentioned, I'm at the Satellite Applications Catapult, and it's a huge privilege to be here today amongst such a highly respected group of experts. The Catapult, we're a very interesting organization. We're a UK-based technology innovation company focused on ensuring that government, academia, and industry are maximizing the opportunities that satellite-enabled data and applications can deliver. And what I really want to do as part of an introduction is sort of come right back down to earth and talk about the sort of the practical usage of Earth observation and geospatial data in humanitarian projects. And as a Catapult, we're working on a number of conflict or humanitarian related projects, including supporting Chemonics and conciliation resources in a UK government funded program, which is called Accept. And this is a cross-border conflict, evidence, policy and trends research program. And we're bringing together leading experts and local researchers to examine the conflict affected borderlands and how conflict connects across borders and those drivers of violent and peaceful behavior. And it's, as I say, it's funded by UK aid, and it's creating actionable research that will help to inform policies and programs. And we're about to start work on a very interesting project looking at the relationships between land cover and pastoralist movements. And this is something that I know that Zand from Conciliation Resources will talk a little bit more about later on. And the discussion that we're having today is super, super timely. For those of you that were at the launch last month, actually, of the UN OCHA's Global Humanitarian Overview, certainly in the London launch, our Minister for State, James Cleverly, for the Middle East and North Africa, spoke about the need for innovation, for data, and for technology to be at the heart of solutions. And I now, clearly as a technologist now, I'm a strong believer in that, but the technology has got to meet the problem. It's not got to be technology looking for a problem to solve. And I think that is incredibly important. Now, what do I mean when I talk about Earth observation? So I'm specifically talking about images that are acquired by the civilian Earth observation satellites. And this type of data essentially comes in two broad forms. Now, we have the optical data. Often it's multispectral, where the sensor is taking images of the Earth's surface across different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. And this provides us with the ability to process that data and extract some useful insight about the materials that the sunlight is reflecting or being absorbed from the features on the ground that we're observing. And a second type of data that we typically work with is radar, or more commonly known as synthetic aperture radar. And this is where we send a microwave pulse from the satellite. It's reflected back from the Earth's surface. And the real advantage of synthetic aperture radar data is that we can penetrate persistent cloud cover. So very, very useful in equatorial areas. And it's often used to monitor things like soil moisture, or with some more advanced processing, we can start to monitor movements of structures. So for example, dams or bridges. And of course, there's a whole host of other data that you can collect from satellite as well. There are a range of satellites collecting information on gases or aerosols in the atmosphere. to look at pollution or looking at industrial activities. We can look at temperature. We can look at wind, wave heights, topography. We can also monitor, for example, ship traffic through the automatic identification systems. And we can also monitor radio frequencies. So there's an awful lot of information that can be collected from satellites. Now, there is a huge number of satellites, both from government. If we think about the very, very successful Landsat series of satellites in the US, or the European Union's Sentinel series, and of course recently a large number of commercial high-resolution satellites. And if we think of one provider who has been in the news recently, an organization called Planet, who recently went public on the New York Stock Exchange, they've built and deployed now more than 450 satellites. They currently have over 200 operating in orbit, and they're collecting over 350 million square kilometers of imagery daily. So an unbelievable resource that's available. Now, when we start to think about satellite imagery and Earth observation, we often think that this is a new and emerging technology, particularly with that recent explosion in commercial data suppliers. But actually, what's truly exciting for our work is that we've got access now to nearly a 50-year archive of data. If we think the Landsat series of satellites started operating back in 1972. So we have a tremendous resource that enables us to assess long-term changes that have been taking place across an area. When thinking about the data to use in your project, what are the key things to be thinking about? As I said, let's really think about, first of all, the problem that needs to be solved. Then you need to think about what is the size of the object or the phenomena on the ground that you want to look at. How often do you want to view that object or that phenomena? And do you need to be able to classify information from the image? So do we need multispectral data, for example, if we're looking at classifying different types of land cover or soil types, or looking at agricultural change? It's definitely not a case of one size fits all, and it's incredibly important to spend time at the beginning really understanding the problem, to really then understand whether Earth observation data has a role to play in the solution. Now, why would you consider using Earth observation data on your projects? Well, it does provide an incredibly rich source of information that is independent, and it provides that authoritative view of what is taking place or what is on the ground at a geographic location at a particular point in time. It's very cost effective, covering large geographic areas. It's available for a multi-year archive, so you can see trends that are taking place over time. And it does provide an opportunity for near real-time assessment of a situation or situational awareness on the ground, and incredibly cost effective. From zero, if you're working with the Landsat data or the European Union Sentinel data sets, up to sort of £25 or so per square kilometre. So it can be an incredibly cost-effective data set. And in some of the work that we're all doing, where we're working in sensitive regions, you can request a holdback from the data suppliers to make sure that the data that you're using for your particular project is not available to anybody else for a period of time. And that can be quite important to make sure, particularly ethically, that the tools that we're using don't necessarily get into the hands of the wrong people. Being a digital data set, what gets really exciting is you can analyze and integrate and fuse with other data sets. And I think this is really, really critical. And this is where the real value comes from. Getting that imagery and putting it into a geospatial or a geographic information system, fusing it with other data. But we do have to be careful. When bringing data sets together, let's make sure that we're not identifying individuals at risk or identifying communities at risk. And what I mean by that is it's okay to potentially identify a community at risk because that's what we're trying to do. But let's think very carefully when we're publishing that information about what we're publishing, when we're publishing it, and to whom we're publishing it. And there's a lot of great work being done around the ethics of geospatial at the moment. Just to look at things like the Locus Charter, developed by both Benchmark and Ethical Geo. And I'm sure this is something we'll talk more about during the discussions, but I think the ethics of using Earth observation data and geospatial analysis are a really, really important topic and something that we need to be discussing as a community more. I think I'll hand back to Erol. I'm sure we'll cover some more of these topics during the discussion.
Thanks, Peter. And I'm so glad you ended there, because I think that's what I would love to dig into is when is it appropriate to be using these technologies? When is it perhaps not appropriate? And I feel like we're at this moment in there is so much access to data, not just satellite data, but other types of technology-enabled data, for example, like the ones that TIMBY are providing. And we're in this space where, what do we do with that? How do we think about that? And I think that's what this panel is about. And I'd like to believe that this discussion is sort of at its beginning, and we should be thinking about these issues lots more, both in the forums that Peter talked about and elsewhere. I'd like to turn to Dr. Alexander Ramsbotham, who is the Director of Research and Innovation at Conciliation Resources. Prior to Conciliation Resources, he was a research fellow in the international program at the Institute for Public Policy Research. Zand has also worked as a specialist advisor to the House of Lords, European Union Select Committee, in its inquiry into the EU strategy for Africa, and before which he was the head of the Peace and Security Program at the United Nations Association in the United Kingdom. He's also been an associate fellow with the International Security Program at Chatham House, so former fellow think tanker, Zand. And I'm sure you've got lots of thoughts, not only on what fellow panelists have said, but also how Conciliation Resources is thinking about this problem set. So Zand, over to you.
Thanks so much, Erol. Yeah, and it's a real privilege to be on this panel. I've been listening really carefully to what other panelists have been saying, and inspired by lots of it, and lots of connections there, including making sure you connect with the local problem and understand what people want to find out locally was really important, you know, and some of those issues, you know, and I've heard Peter's sales pitch before for Satellite Catapult, and we're working with Satellite Catapult, or we hope to be soon, as Conciliation Resources. So I certainly tune into some of the things that he was saying there. So Peter mentioned that Conciliation Resources is working with Satellite Catapult as part of the Accept research program. So I won't go back over that, but we're really happy to be part of that consortium. I'll talk a little bit about some of our research that we're going to be doing, looking at pastoral movement in Africa and violent conflict associated with that. And part of the problem here is that pastoral movement is becoming less predictable because of climate change and environmental damage and other issues, which is making it more violent, but also making it harder to resolve the violent conflict. So we're hoping that working with satellite imagery and analysis and other forms of research, we can help to make some of the pastoral routes a bit more predictable, and that will help to make conflict resolution more effective. And that's kind of in a nutshell what we're trying to do. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about why we need satellite technology. And then secondly, how do we think that might help? I just wanted to stress at the beginning that Conciliation Resources, we're really an organization that works with people. You know, that's our bread and butter. We're interested in relationships and peace building, and we work at a local level. We invest a lot of time in partnerships, with local partnerships with people in the places that we work. So we're really excited about this opportunity that we think we found in satellite technology, but it's new for us, and we're quite wary of it as well. You know, Peter mentioned some of the ethical issues to deal with, and those are real present issues for us that we're concerned about, as well as being excited about. So it's a great position and moment to be in, but we're not 100% sure where it goes next. Why do we need satellite technology for this problem? Well, pastoralism relies on mobility to move livestock between grazing sites. But how to manage pastoral mobility is getting harder. Changes in land use due to environmental degradation linked to climate change have limited grazing sites, and are disrupting grazing routes. This is a contributing factor to exacerbating tensions amongst pastoralist groups, between pastoralist groups and sedentary farmers, but also brings pastoral movement into contact with other types of violence, civil war, but also violent banditry and this kinds of thing. And because it's much more predictable, much less predictable rather, because of environmental degradation due to climate change amongst other factors, it's getting much harder to manage this kind of stuff. Pastoral routes are increasingly blocked or disrupted, and it increases pastoral encroachment into croplands and pushes pastoralists into areas of instability. There are good examples of how pastoral movement can be managed peacefully. CR has been involved in supporting local peace agreements, for example, and arrangements to help manage pastoral movement in non-violent ways. But today, the kind of traditional conflict resolution mechanisms that have helped to manage pastoral movement in the past are being really stretched, because of the new challenges that some of the demands put in place by environmental damage and climate change have caused. So, how do we think that satellite technology might help us here? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, a key ambition of the research is to understand how satellite data analysis can help provide a clearer understanding of pastoral movement. We, in our research, aim to combine local field research with data and analysis from satellite imagery to map trends in pastoral movement and violent conflict. It's a multidisciplinary approach that we'll be taking. So we'll be speaking to pastoralists and agricultural communities to gather their perceptions of changes in pastoral movement, combining their insights with satellite and remote sensing analysis for ground truthing and validation. And it was really interesting what Anjali was saying earlier on about not being extractive and engaging with the local communities. And the essence of our sort of inquiry here really comes from our partnerships with local peace institutions in some of the places where they're working, where they're saying they've been telling us some of the things that we have been using to sort out some of these conflicts really aren't working anymore. If we had a better sense of where the movement was happening, we think that would be a real help, So we're really sort of trying to translate some of the stuff we hear on the ground and support ways to deal with this kind of thing. So where might satellite imagery contribute? Peter was describing some of the ways that some of the different types of analysis that we can get from satellites technology. He was talking about looking back over quite a few years. I think vegetation change is a key determinant in where livestock herds can graze and roam. So we hope to analyze changes in vegetation in our study areas over recent decades, linked to issues of climate change, ecological change, and better biodiversity, to get a better understanding of the changes in patterns of vegetation and how changes in pastoral movement map onto this. We also hope to look at sort of weather patterns and those kinds of things. One of the things we are investigating a bit and is potentially quite exciting is, can we look forward a little bit as well? Can we predict where routes will be going in the future using these using some of this technology? We're also keen to see, how much we can scope actual pastoral routes as well. We need to learn more about the sort of level of detail we can go into to map some of these types of movement, but there's also some of these sort of ethical questions come into play as well about this that Peter was bringing up. So we're not exactly sure how that will pan out, and we need to have more conversations with Satellite Catapult, and we also hope to hook up experts like Peter with some of our field researchers and the communities that they talk to on the ground in the places that we're going to try and get that conversation going. So we're really looking into the right things and taking care of people at the same time. So the outcomes of this, yeah, as I've mentioned already, we hope to understand better pastoral movement, where they're going, what are some of the places that they'll get to, what are some of the hotspots that they might go through on the way. One ambition is to, can we predict, by getting a better sense of where pastoral movement will be going in the future, can we get a better sense of where those hotspots may be? One of the ideas we're exploring is, if we anticipate that there's going to be an outbreak of violence coming out somewhere, can we send a sort of advanced peacemaking party out there to negotiate peaceful passageway in advance? That would be really exciting if we can get that to work. It's not quite clear how all the pieces of the jigsaw fit together yet, but that's where we are in our thinking. It's really exciting, I think, and the potential is great. But we need to do some more work, and that's the exciting challenge that we have lying ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, and I want to turn to Sahar for reactions, and actually she posed some really interesting questions about what better tools can we use to understand complexity and what the role of technology is. And so Sahar, would love your thoughts on that. Zand, I'm glad that you expanded beyond just the ethics here, because I was, as you were talking, I was thinking about, I lived in Ethiopia during the Arab Spring, where the only website that worked across the whole country was ethiopia.gov.et. And if I had gone at that moment to one of my government friends and said, look at all this cool satellite data that's actually going to be used to, map where pastoralists in the Somali region are going to be able to go and not go due to climate change, that's not what they would have heard. They would have heard spy. And so there's not only ethics, there's kind of dealing with local governments and I think very real concerns that folks have around the world. So thanks for those thoughts and for indulging my quick exercise in nostalgia there. But Sahar, if I could go back to you, and then I want to open it up. We wanted to do this panel as if we're all sitting around a table, perhaps this one over here, having tea. And so as Anjali's doing. So Sahar, let me start with you, and then would love others to just jump in.
Yeah, I mean, as Zand was speaking about, how can we use some of this technology to be predictive? I was thinking of another example we saw from Yemen, where the changes in flood routes in the country and the water passages have also intersected in a very unexpected way with conflict dynamics, both in terms of military actors now basically waiting to jump on the opportunity for when floods do pass through certain areas to take military action, because they know that the other side is a bit incapacitated. To the other side of this, where you have IDPs who had been moved to areas that were water scarce, because those are less desirable areas, now find themselves in the middle of a sort of, a contestation of power, because their areas, because of the changing patterns, their areas are becoming more water rich. And so they're facing greater conflict with local communities, as well as being the victims of conflict between the conflicting parties who are now trying to sort of, lay their hand on those areas. And one thing that I was thinking as Zand was speaking is this something that we can do as well with the kind of data, whether satellite or another, which is try to predict how these changes might play out, and what does that mean for how we intervene, and who uses that data and how, right? Because you do have here a plethora of actors who all think that they're the good guys. So they're all gonna want to use that data in some form or another, and some have some pretty, powerful sort of cyber warfare capabilities on their side from various government sponsors. So it's a complex set of questions for us to dig into, and I'd love the thoughts of my fellow panelists. And another way that I've been thinking about the use of data to better understand the intersection of these two systems, that's also predictive to what to Zan's point, is in trying to use some of the advanced tech we have to do computational models of some of these systems. So on the conflict side, we've understood for a while that conflict is not linear. It doesn't follow a nice phase of, we see things are heating up, there's disagreement, there's discord, there's tension, then there might be an outbreak, and then there's like a post-conflict. Reality doesn't work that way, and we now understand that we need a systems thinking approach to understand how these systems work. The challenge is that, ironically, we don't have enough data to actually try to quantify some of these dynamics. We can take the time to sort of analyze them and have those discussions and understand how these systems are operating, how are the various conflict factors affecting each other and maintaining those conflict systems. But if we try to get predictive and we try to see, okay, well, if this factor increases, if, dissatisfaction with X or grievance or violence levels here or weaker rule of law, that's a lot of complex data to try to capture and then to try to see how it interacts. And I don't know if we have if the technology is there to help us do that. Maybe I'll stop here with my musings.
You're raising some very important points there, Sahar, and I think there's a lot of great work being done, both in the commercial sector, but clearly also within the academic sector, looking at the development of digital twins, particularly if we think about sort of physical Earth systems. You're talking about the groundwater challenge in Yemen, and we're doing quite a lot of work there at the moment, and it's Earth observation and geospatial analysis, but being carried out by people who are experts in hydrology, in hydrogeology, in agriculture. And there's a lot of modeling that's being done to create essentially a digital twin of water resources across the Yemen country. And there's a lot of work being done, in particular at the moment, actually, at Oxford University, bringing together machine learning and artificial intelligence and starting to think about, can you bring together the physical Earth systems and what I would call the more socioeconomic type Earth systems. So I think we're not too far away from tools being available to start to do some of those things that you're thinking about. And certainly in terms of the computer power and resources that are now available, particularly with the advent of cloud computing and the massive compute resources of the likes of of Google, of Amazon, and Microsoft, etc., that we all potentially have access to, we are getting very, very close to having some of those capabilities. So it's definitely something to look out for. But the one point I think is super, super important here is that from a technology point of view, it's always the modeling, the analysis, the interpretation is always being done by somebody who is an expert in their field, whether they are an agronomist or a hydrogeologist or a transportation planner or a conflict advisor. It's not a geospatial person making those decisions. We can enable and provide technology and data, but the decision is made by somebody who really understands the implications of it on the ground. And I think that's another really important point when we think about some of the ethics. You were mentioning there that things like the IDP camps and understanding water resources. It goes back to a point that I was trying to make at the beginning, that it's really important to think about when you're presenting the findings of some analysis, who might have access to that. And particularly when we're talking about geospatial presentation, we often think about, a picture paints 1,000 words and a map can portray so much information. Well, it can do, but it can portray information not only to the people that are going to go do good, but potentially to people who may not have such an honest outlook on life. And we have to think very carefully about what is the scale of the map data that we're presenting. You know, are we presenting something in a static map in a report, or is it an interactive map? And as you zoom in and out of that interactive map, are we displaying information that is generalized in terms of its location, or is it actually the exact physical location? So a number of things that do need to be thought about. And then they're not insurmountable challenges, but I think everybody involved in the work that we're doing just needs to always have that sort of ethical wrapper around the presentation that they're doing.
I would kind of add to that and say, like, the predictive abilities of these types of systems, not only on the satellite level, but like when you start combining projects, and this is something that happens a lot in the environmental sphere, unfortunately, is that everybody's siloed. So WWF is one entity, and Conservation International is another entity, and you know, there's so many, and for whatever reasons we don't have to get into, their data are quite siloed. When you start creating liaisons between countries that have contiguous forests, or if you start creating liaisons between organizations that are working in the same areas, all of a sudden the data points stop being like the hundreds, but they become the thousands and the millions. So both at the kind of satellite level, so big data, you're also talking about like local collection from monitoring systems and so on. So if you know, in some cases, Timby's working with 6 or 7 or 10 different organizations within the same country, and we're starting to get those kind of trust systems in place where those organizations are more willing to share their data. So they become more powerful in a sense in terms of the predictive capabilities. So I think that that's like at the big scale, but also at the local scale, like putting data in the hands of people to create those systems of prediction is really important, and starting to see why collaborating at the government level, at whatever levels there are. And I would say the same thing in terms of who has access to the data. So how do you create silos that allow people to be protected in some ways, but that there can be some oversight overall so that people can have these predictive capabilities? And maybe you're not sharing it, at least on the TIMBY system, you're not sharing the granular data overall, you're sharing the analytics, the hotspots, the information that would be important for the top levels, but you don't have to share the granular data that might get particular individuals, for example, in difficulty. So thinking about those kind of like big level and little level, and understanding the